Ladies and gentlemen, Rex Bear Leak Project. How the heck are you? Would you just look at it? Oh, yeah. The legend Matthew LaCroix is with us again. Really excited for this opportunity. I finally got it. The Stage of Time. This is an incredible read because it has a lot of documentation of tablets in the back and specific reference points. And today we're going to talk about the 300,000 year timeline of the gods, the Anunnaki, Gilgamesh, his search for immortality. It's very deep. A lot to discuss. Matt, thanks a lot for coming on the Leak Project. How the heck are you?
Hey, Rex, I'm great. It's awesome to be back on here with you. I always enjoy our discussions.
Yeah, me too. We take it next level every single time. And I'm just going to give you an open platform, my friend, and let's jump into this.
All right, bud, let's go. So we're going to go through a timeline to try to place where these specific events of human history fall in line. And what do I mean by that? Don't we already know the truth of human history? Well, like many of people on this channel probably already aware of by now, whoever's listening to this, we're told in school that human civilizations arose 6,000 years ago, and that we have this slow linear build up to where we are now. And that's the entire story. And everything can be fit in this nice, neat and tidy little narrative that describes the entire epic of human history. All of our achievements, all of the challenges we went through, and all of the downfalls and the rises to get to where we are now. But when you actually look into some of the evidence of ancient history that we're about to go over today, some of the stuff that's outside the mainstream, things that maybe you have to go seek for yourself and read for yourself to understand, you'll quickly realize that there's this entire undiscussed and undisclosed, in terms of being in our educational system and within society, aspects of human history that go back far further than we've ever been told. And in more ways than one, it's not just this linear perspective that goes back a lot longer than we've been told, but actually has these epics where human civilizations were nearly destroyed, and then they had to rise up again, and then they fell again, and then they had to rise up. And we're going to go through those different epics and try to place how old is human civilization in terms of the direct evidence we have in front of us, and what is the timeline that we can establish and put together to understand everything that happened before us. You know, a lot of people that I talk to, I tell them I research and write about ancient history, and they sort of roll their eyes and they're like, "Oh, that's exciting, right?" Because they're thinking of this narrative that we've been told, this very, very linear perspective of, you know, the uneventful civilizations just being hunter-gatherers and then slowly figuring things out, and then they fight a little bit here and there in different empires, and then, hey, here we are. But that's not really what the story is at all. And to me, it doesn't do any of the incredible events justice that have happened in our past if we don't recognize when they occurred and what happened, to try to understand, how do we get to this place we are today? What are all the things that happened before us? And that's what we're about to break down right now. Now, if people know who I am and a lot of the work I've done, if they've read my last book, The Stage of Time, they know that I talk a lot about cuneiform tablets, talk a lot about Sumerian and Akkadian history. But there's one tablet that we're going to break down today that I haven't really done before in a very extensive way, and that's the Epic of Gilgamesh. But we're not going to break it down like you perhaps have seen in other places. We're going to go through in a very specific type of way that I use a certain type of technique that I can share with a lot of others to help people understand this, that you can use for every single cuneiform tablet and many other stories as well that go beyond that. So what we're going to be doing is linking each one of these cuneiform tablets that I'm going to be mentioning and placing it within a certain probability timeline. I can't get exact because we've lost so much of this information that we only have these little tiny remnants and pieces left to try to understand the greater picture. So we're going to have to be within a small ballpark figure of what these tablets are actually telling you. So what I'm going to be breaking down today and linking and connecting is going to be the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Sumerian King List, the Legend of Etana, the Eridu Genesis, and the Atrahasis. And I'm even going to throw in a little instructions of Shuruppak in there. But basically, we're going to be taking all of these and actually creating a timeline to understand when all these events occurred and when all these cities these pre-Diluvian and post-Diluvian cities when they existed. So to start, I want to give a little background first, because the Epic of Gilgamesh is going to be the sort of the main caveat of our discussion. So I'll give a little history first behind that, so people understand where all this came from. So the Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the longest sets of cuneiform tablets we have. And that's perhaps one of the reasons why a lot of people haven't read it, because it is huge. It is 12 tablets long, but some of the tablets are very, very long. And in terms of the actual length, and they have a lot of information packed in them. Now, when people look at the Epic of Gilgamesh on the surface, like if you were to go online and do a search for Epic of Gilgamesh and, why is it important? You'll find a lot of areas where they talk about how it's considered the greatest poem ever written or the greatest epic ever written, but that it's considered just a myth and that none of it is real. And it's in terms of actual events, and that it was the whole purpose of it in the perspective of some of these modern academics is simply to learn from different triumphs and downfalls and how to grow on a human archetypal level, getting over these challenges that we have to grow and raise our vibration. That's the surface viewpoint, the linear perspective that a lot of these modern academics have, except that there's little what I call nuggets that exist within these stories that have specific cities and time periods that are mentioned that can't be just a myth and impossible, because they can connect to so many other tablets, and that's what we're about to talk about. So the Epic of Gilgamesh was 12 cuneiform tablets that were found, and they were found by Henry Austin Layard in 1849, and that's an incredibly important date, because that may be the most important human discovery, in my opinion, of all. Because what he found was, when they were in the ancient city of Nineveh, Iraq, they were uncovering what was called the Ashurbanipal Library, this ancient library of cuneiform tablets they found buried under sand and debris and rock. And they discovered these just piles of cuneiform tablets all scattered and thrown all over the place, buried underground because of how much time has gone by. And so Henry Austin Layard finds all these cuneiform tablets, but he can't read Sumerian or Akkadian. And so he just gathers them all together and brings them back to England, to the University of Oxford, and they just sit on a shelf. And that's where the story begins behind all this. So just a super quick little background on the importance of Nineveh. Nineveh was a city that had the first aqueduct system ever created on Earth. And it's also the location of nearby Jirwan, where the largest cuneiform writing that we've ever seen has ever been found. Cuneiform writing that's 3 times bigger than anything we've seen before. And most of it is untranslated. And I've done some talks about that in the past, and that's not really where the focus of this is going to be. But the point of that is that Nineveh was a very important city. And it was the location of where the famous Hanging Gardens were, not in Babylon, because that's the whole point of the aqueduct system, to provide this endless amount of water to create this incredible lavish place. So in the city of Nineveh, we had this king named Ashurbanipal, who in his great wisdom decided that his legacy, instead of conquering and all these other mentalities that a lot of other kings have tried to establish and focus on, he decided to send out every single sage and person that was close to him to amass and find every single cuneiform tablet he could. And we're talking about, so to start with this time period of Ashurbanipal, we're talking about something somewhere around 4,500 years ago, or in that time period. And that is actually on the newer side of what we're about to get into. So that's the later time period of some of these Mesopotamian civilizations who, because think about it, Ashurbanipal, they had to go seek out these cuneiform tablets. They were already becoming lost, and they had to go find them. And so we think of Ashurbanipal in that time period as the very beginning and where all these were written, but it was, in many ways, it was like the very end. And that's where the story really begins. So Henry Austin Layard brings back this huge mass of cuneiform tablets from this library, and they sit on a dusty shelf because nobody can translate them. until 1875. And that's a date that I really want people to remember in conjunction with 1849, because so many online, and it's not as much as it used to be. Rex probably remembers, year or two ago, there was this huge campaign online where a lot of the cuneiform information, including things like the word Anunnaki, were being discredited because they were being told that that information was a creation from Zecharia Sitchin and that it wasn't real. And so people said, oh, okay, all these fantastic stories, he just made them up. None of them are real. He didn't. There may have been some inaccuracies done. Go ahead, Rex.
Yeah, I mean, definitely he did not. And you brought up that timeline of the 1840s and the 1850s. I just wanted to do a quick screen share, then let's go back to your screen. But this is important because...
You want me to stop sharing?
Yeah, I mean, I want you to go back to your screen share in just a moment, but I am going to bring this up. The Babylonian legends of the creation and the fight between Bel and the dragon. These are Assyrian tablets that were discovered in the mid-1800s from Nineveh. And I think that it might actually even be the same person that you brought up a moment ago when it was discovered in the 1800s. But what's interesting is when you read through these tablets, there's two different usurping of power stories. One is with Marduk.
Yeah.
The other one is with Ashur,
who is Enlil. That was the name that Enlil had used in that region of Mesopotamia.
Very interesting. So I just wanted to point that out because we're having a matrix sync here. The timelines are fascinating, and I was able to link up dates to 28,500 years ago. We were looking at these tablets. The Etana descent to the netherworld was probably about 28,500 years ago. But if you're wondering, folks, how we've got this 300,000 year timeline, it's based on the Sumerian King List. If you take those dates back, it's over 280,000 years, and there might be some missing time in there also, getting to about 300,000 years. It all goes back to the Sumerian King List, and there's so many different stories that correlate dates and times. I think that it gives it a solid amount of validity, especially when you look at all the different compartments around the world based on religion and science that link back to the Sumerian King List in some way, shape, or form, or these ancient Mesopotamian tablets. Your thoughts?
And we're gonna be getting into that more as we go along. We're gonna talk about the Sumerian King List and how that whole timeline plays into this timeline, because they connect extremely well. It's like a key in a lock, and we're gonna go over that in a second. But yeah, you're right, Rex. Essentially, we have this timeline that if you believe the Sumerian King List, which I do, and we'll go over how those years and those reigns were possible in a second, because the Epic of Gilgamesh gives us clues to how some of those could have been possible. You know, how could a king have lived ruled for thousands of years and lived for, in some ways we look at Enoch and some of these names, they lived for hundreds of years. How is that possible? We're going to go into that in a second. But getting back to what I was saying is there was this perception that was rampant online that none of this was real and that it was all a mistranslation. And that's what I'm trying to get at right here, is that this was first translated by a Syriologist expert, the top expert in the world. And to this day, if you look up research on George Smith, you'll find that even the Syriologists like Stephanie Daly and others, they sometimes credit him as the great father of translating these, because he was the first. The point is, George Smith translated all of these cuneiform tablets from the Ashurbanipal library in 1875, and all of the names and the types of cities we're about to talk about, and they can be directly connected to all these other tablets, and they're all translated well over 100 years ago to show their authenticity rather than just some new thing that someone decided to come up with. And that's a very important point to make, because these are significant moments in history that can't be forgotten. So George Smith is sitting in England, and he's looking at this huge pile of cuneiform tablets from the Ashurbanipal library, and he starts translating them. And he gets the Epic of Gilgamesh and a couple others, and it's reported that he started running around the room basically like screaming, because he realized that he had stumbled upon the entire lost history of our human civilization. And these were the stories that we're trying to encompass, the events that had occurred back then, the specific cities, and what led to this destruction of a great civilization that once existed. So This is this is the piece that I want to get across. So, and this is the hardest thing. Most modern academic experts today tell you that those cuneiform tablets and these stories we read are just simply a symbolic representation of understanding how some great hero or some individual throughout history overcame difficult odds and then figured out these symbolic things to reach a higher state. And that's true, but there's also a completely other side of this that we're going to go over. And so when I read, doesn't matter what cuneiform tablet it is, they all follow the same rules. You have these three different parts that you can break them down to. And this is what I want people to understand if they try to go in and do this themselves. The first piece is that all these stories have some kind of a hero that has to triumph over something. Okay, some kind of a journey, some kind of an event. And it's not always literal. Sometimes it's completely symbolic, and it has nothing to do with what it seems like on the surface. The second thing is there's always some deep symbolic aspect to it that relates to things on multiple levels, because that's how they thought back then. They always thought to themselves, well, if we can write about a certain idea that can convey multiple things, we'll do it because it's a much more efficient way to convey a message. That's number two. And number one and number two are why these tablets have remained so hidden over time, because the majority of these tablets are made up of those two pieces. And so people read through and they're like, okay, this is just not really giving me any information that can help me, and they put it away and they ignore it. But if you look, especially at the beginning and the end, typically of these tablets, you'll find these little, what I call nuggets of truth. And this is part number 3 of what to look for. And this is the most important part of all, except the problem is it represents the smallest amount of what these cuneiform tablets have written in them. So if you were to try to find what I'm about to talk about, you would have to specifically know what you were looking for. And what am I looking for? You're looking for anywhere where it mentions something about the setting of when these stories occurred, where they occurred, and the events that transpired during them. And if you can essentially pinpoint that, you can place when these occurred in human history and separate all the symbolism that's mixed in between. So to starting with the Epic of Gilgamesh on the first tablet, it states that Gilgamesh was a tyrant king of the Mesopotamian city of Uruk. So let's stop right there. Boom. We're like one sentence in from the Epic of Gilgamesh, and there is a nugget right there. Why would all of these be considered simply myths and not true if we're getting a specific city that then can be referenced to multiple other tablets? If you look on the map I have on the screen, you can see Uruk. It's right in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia. It was an ancient city that was a post-Diluvian city. And that's very important to understand. That means it was a city that was created after the Great Deluge, the flood. So it was a newer city, which means that means that Gilgamesh was actually one of the last heroes of these stories that was able to write his story down to carry on. And after that, we have almost nothing else. He represents the last person, the last king who wrote this extensive set of cuneiform tablets to have us understand these events. And then just like that, Sumerian and Akkadian died out, and everything was lost. Those great civilizations over time, even the people in Mesopotamia stopped speaking Sumerian and Akkadian over time, and it turned into some of these other languages, and they were basically, you couldn't even read them because no one spoke them anymore. And so for thousands of years, these languages went unspoken. And that's why people had such a difficulty translating them later on. So right there, we have a basis to start our story. So it means that Gilgamesh was a king of Uruk. So that's how we can know. And we know that Uruk was a post-Diluvian city. That means that it's at the oldest, it's probably somewhere around 8,000 years old. At the oldest, it's somewhere in that time period of between 6,000 and 8,000 years old. We don't know the exact truth because a lot of that evidence was destroyed over time. And so in the story of Gilgamesh as a higher level, Gilgamesh is this tyrant king from Uruk who is seeking to grow on a deep level. He's got a lot of deep-seated issues that he wants to overcome. And so there's this whole story of how he goes to the cedar woods and he fights all these beasts and this great bowl of heaven. And those are those symbolic things I want to get across, where, okay, it's important to understand overcoming lessons, but read through them and then get to the pieces that are important. That's what I say. And what you find out is that in that story, he mentions this flood hero character he calls Untapishti or Untapishtim. And you find out that Untapishtim was Atrahasis. So it's the same character as the Epic of Atrahasis, which means that those two tablets all automatically overlap, because Gilgamesh eventually decides that the whole purpose of his journey was that he wants to seek immortality. And the only reason he does that is because A, he's mortal, and B, he knows that Untapishti, Atrahasis, they have multiple names in different civilizations and epics, also known as Zayasudra. I know that's confusing, but there are 3 names that are given for him, even a 4th if you want to use the biblical name of Noah, okay? But all those names are all the same person. It's the flood hero I call Atrahasis. And in the Epoch of Gilgamesh is the only place where it's called Untapishti, but that's what he calls him. So anyway, Gilgamesh seeks immortality because he knows that Atrahasis found immortality, okay? And that's where this whole story starts to get interesting. So in this journey that he's taking, he mentions multiple cities in that. In the story, he mentions how he sees or meets basically the ghost or spirit of Etana. When I saw that, I actually was completely floored, because Etana, yet again, this place is where this occurred in history, because Etana was a king who wrote the tablet called the Legend of Etana. And in that tablet, he talks all about, and I mention this all the time, about how he was the first king who was created and designated to rule after the flood. And he created and rose up with this great city of Kish. And in the previous screenshot, I showed Kish is on the left, the abandoned city that's the tallest image. So, and you could still see that today, because it was rebuilt multiple times over as the ages went on. So he mentions Etana and how Etana is no longer alive. Well, so if Etana is mentioned as being a ghost or spirit, and he meets him in this vision and traveling to these different realms, which we'll go into, then it means that Etana is now dead, and that city in that time period that Etana mentions was before him. So then, knowing that, and knowing that Atrahasis wrote the Epic of Atrahasis, which was the events basically right before and after the flood, we can place all of these in a specific timeline. Now, Rex mentioned the Sumerian King List. We know that is among the oldest of all, because it presents dates that go back to the very beginning. Every tablet says the same thing. The first city ever created on Earth was Eridu. Every single one says that. And so you get something like the Epic of Eridu Genesis. You get the Sumerian King List that specifically mentioned that city. And then the Sumerian King List mentions all the other cities like Bad Tabira and Lagash. But the last city on the Sumerian King List is mentioned as being Shuruppak. What does that matter? Shuruppak was the last city that Atrahasis, Untapishti, ruled in. Okay, so remember that. So Gilgamesh is seeking Atrahasis, who is the last king of Shuruppak, which was the last city before everything was destroyed and human civilizations had to start over again. And that's why Atrahasis tells the story of the flood. And as you're about to see, so does Gilgamesh, because he meets Untapishti, Atrahasis, and he tells him this grand story. So if I was to put all these in an order, you have a timeline that goes back potentially 200 to 300,000 years that would start with something like the Sumerian King List with the Eridu Genesis and the basically the myth of Adapa and the instructions of Shuruppak, and then the Atrahasis as the last one. Those are the tablets that represent the pre-Diluvian history that we talk about. And there are others too, like Rex mentioned. There are others as well. They're not as famous. And then we have this flood event, and we get the first tablet ever of the first city ever created, which was Kish, the legend of Etana. And then because we know that he meets the spirit of Etana, we know that these events of Gilgamesh occurred right after Etana. That's how we can place the legend of Etana at something like 8,000 or 9,000 years old, and then we can place Gilgamesh just after that. And as I said, that represents the last set of cuneiform tablets we pretty much have before that entire time period of human history was basically lost. So Gilgamesh goes out and he's trying to seek immortality. That's his obsession. And the interesting thing is, if you look into these tablets before, some of these kings that are mentioned in the Sumerian King List that reigned for hundreds, if not thousands of years, which seems totally insane to us now. But if you look at that, how could that be? How could that be? How is that possible? Well, Gilgamesh is mortal. He's seeking Atrahasis, who found immortality. Atrahasis, Utpishti, was the last great king before the flood. That's an important point to make. It means that human civilizations, and some of these great kings especially, had a completely different lifespan than human civilizations after. And that's where this immortality obsession came into play. So we find out, and then to label these cities that came after, to put them in order, we have Kish, we have Babylon, we have Uruk, we have Ur. All of these cities came after these events, and Nineveh's in there as well, Ashur and Nineveh. So if you look at the map that I have on the screen, you can basically separate those cities into two to three even completely different time periods, where some of them were totally wiped out, where a place like Shuruppak or Eridu has almost nothing left. Eridu is just these, which they did find, by the way. It's just, and this is amazing, right? Just think about this. Eridu is considered in multiple tablets to be the first city ever created in human civilization. And what does it look like right now? It's sitting out in the desert with nothing around it. Nobody's watching it. Dust is just blowing over the site, and nobody cares about it. How can you look at that and not see something wrong with this picture, where these aspects of human history are being completely ignored, and civil wars are being fought in those countries where all those ancient ruins are found? It's like they want that time period to be completely erased from our memory, so that we never knew that it existed, so we don't know the entire timeline of human history, because it would redefine everything. It would change how we perceive ourselves. So getting back to what I'm saying, I get off on a lot of these exciting stories, but if you were to read the Epic of Gilgamesh, I would basically read the very beginning, and then I would go all the way to the end, tablets 10 and 11, because in between you have a lot of that just symbolic type of story, like I was saying. But right when you get into tablets 10 and 11, you start getting into some of those nuggets, like I mentioned. And some of the information that's in the Epic of Gilgamesh completely changes our perspective on understanding some key questions that I've gotten so many times from people and have struggled to try to understand. But in many ways, it reassured my thought process on what actually happened, because it said the same thing. And I'm gonna go over that in a second. So what we find, specifically around the area of immortality, and why these great kings seem to live for so long, and then after, all of a sudden we had lifespans that were like 100 years or so, right? What happened? Well, we find out some clues to that in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So in that, he goes and seeks out Utpishti, Atrahasis, and along the way, there's a separate cuneiform tablet that's written that is called the Death of Biligames. I don't know if anyone's even heard of that. And the reason why most people probably haven't heard of it is it's the newest text that's ever been found. It's very, very recent translation that's been done, discovery of this text. And why do I mention that? Well, Biligames was another name for Gilgamesh, okay? And the Death of Biligames gives us some really key pieces of understanding how human timelines could have been so skewed, and we don't understand how some of these kings could have lived that long. So, and I quote in the Death of Biligames, it states, and I'll break this down after I read it. After the assembly had made the deluge sweep over, Zayasudra, one of mankind, still lived. From that time, we swore that mankind should not have eternal life. Boom, right there in the Death of Biligames, it gives you an answer. And so who was Zayasudra? Again, that was one of the names given for Atrahasis, Untapishti. He was considered the last man who ever found immortality from the gods, okay? And it states that after that time period, the assembly. Now, what is the assembly? Well, the assembly was what was known as the Council of 12. And we know that that was these royal sky beings that we call the Anunnaki. These beings that may have come from some kind of another dimension, another location, another universe. We don't know. But we do know that the ancients called these sky gods, and they said that they basically were the architects of all of civilization. They were the ones who created over and over and over again, okay? And actually, Etana says that very specifically in the legend of Etana. He says that they picked him, and they call themselves the ordainers of destinies, and that they decide the fate of basically anyone that's important here. Like they have some kind of a way to observe our reality and observe timelines all at the same time. It's absolutely fascinating. So getting back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, he's seeking immortality. And in the story of how he finds it, it's completely incredible because it says that he traveled to the ocean at the end of the world, also known as the waters of death, where Untapishti, Atrahasis, is located. Now, what is that place? Well, the more I've looked at this, the more I don't think it was a real place in terms of an island somewhere on the edge of the earth or something. I think what that means, the ocean at the end of the world, ocean has often been used as a term to separate realms. I think it was referencing some kind of another realm, perhaps the underworld. And you get that clue because it says waters of death. Death and incarnation has always been a place that's been occurred and managed and balanced in the underworld. Therefore, that's where and you see a lot of that too, Rex, with things like Inanna's descent in the underworld, finding some of these other individuals who have made mistakes to try to find immortality, and then they end up getting stuck down there forever or something. You constantly see that. Now, I want to mention in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the name Anunnaki is mentioned at least 8 times. For those who don't think that that word is real and that it actually references something real like sky gods, go look at how many times that's mentioned. Just do a Control F and just search for it. You won't believe it because it talks about it very extensively. So he goes in to try to seek immortality. And on tablet 10, it states, the Anunnaki, the great gods, held an assembly. Both death and life they have established, but the day of death they do not disclose. Again, linking that term, ordainers of destinies, and how they somehow hijacked all of our reality, and they have control over so much more than we realize, and that we may be somehow like pawns in this physical reality that are being pushed and pulled and influenced from non-physical dimensions all the time, and we just can't perceive it and we don't understand it. But in many ways, that helps to help us to understand how all these kings got so much knowledge and talked all about how they were chosen and had these visions and met with all these individuals. And I'm gonna get into a direct reading right now from tablet 11 that shows some of that as well. So on tablet 11, Gilgamesh finally reaches Untapishti, Atrahasis, right, in this other realm. And the story of how he gets there is very reminiscent of that famous scene where this, you have that lake or whatever it is, ocean that's all foggy, and a boatman comes with the huge pole to pick him up and to lead him into the underworld. That story is described in many ways in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and I would go as far to say that's where it probably began. That whole idea of, well, how would you get to the underworld? How would you traverse and get to another realm? And that's what he tries to explain. I think it's difficult for us to understand now where we are. But so on tablet 11, it starts by stating, because he meets Atrahasis, he finally achieves what he's been trying to search for all along, this great journey to finally seek this man who's found immortality. And he states on tablet 11, I look at you, Untapishti. Your form is no different. You are just like me. How was it you stood with the gods of assembly? How did you find life eternal? Said Untapishti to him, to Gilgamesh, let me disclose, O Gilgamesh, a matter most secret. To you I will tell a mystery of gods. And this is where you got to pay attention. This is probably the most important piece in the entire tablet. It says, and this is coming from Atrahasis, who was alive before the flood. So he knows a lot of things, and he found immortality. He states, the town of Sharupak, a city well known to you, which stands on the banks of the river Euphrates. This city was old. The gods were once in it. That's where I want to stop for a second. So automatically we can confirm that he, just like the Sumerian King List states, that his in this he mentions, oh, your father Ubaratutu, as in Atrahasis Untapishti, your father Ubaratutu was the previous king, and then you became the king of Sharupak. All that's mentioned in here, and look at what it says. It gives you a basis for where the city was located. It says it was along the banks of the river Euphrates. Look at the image I have in front of me. And then it states that the city was very old, proving that it was one of these ancient cities that was before the flood. But then the last piece is the most important of all. The gods were once in it. Were once in it. And then
I'm sorry. I can't. This is long enough. There's somebody in here that is continuing to say how we're promoting Sitchin and that we should go to Sitchin.com. Well, first of all, we're not promoting Sitchin. And second of all, I've been to SitchinWasWrong.com. It's not a very compelling website. I've interviewed Dr. Heiser before. The information he gave me was great, but it didn't prove to me in any way, shape, or form that he was any more right than anybody else. So no, we're not promoting Sitchin, donkey. We are having an open conversation here. And if you don't like it, bye-bye. Have a wonderful day. See ya.
And I can let me answer to that. None of the translations that I have in my book, anything that I talk about on my videos, including this translation I'm reading right now, came from Sitchin. I want to make that clear. These translations.
This guy on the internet that's in chat, he says, this guy obviously knows because he's talking on the internets. He thinks he's got it all figured out.
Remember, these translations I'm reading right now were translated in 1875 by George Smith, like I mentioned.
But wait, then that takes away what this dude just said, that everything he just said just goes out the window.
Exactly. And if people didn't do their homework, if they didn't do their homework to realize that these translations have been done by far more Assyriologist experts than just Zechariah Sitchin, they would just believe that lie. And I think that lie is a psyop that was created to try to take this information and make it so that it's all fake, so that people won't look into it. But as you can see, some of the information in here is incredible. Now, getting back to that last quote I said, it says the gods were once in it, the city of Sharupak. And then it says that they left. They departed during the events of the deluge. And I'll read that in a second. But the reason I bring that up, so many people ask me, oh, so if these Anunnaki, these great gods were real, what happened to them? Where are they? Well, it says that they were actually here in physical form at one point. It says it right there. It says they were in the city. How can they be in the city and not in physical form and then not be there anymore? It means that they were real and that they were in Sharupak, and it was the last city that they were ever part of this physical world with, and then they departed and they went into non-physical realms. And that's what happened. And we essentially were left here on our own with some influences over time, and we can talk about that. But essentially we were left here as mortal mankind to just fend on our own and find our own way. But that's an important point to make, because that actually gives us an answer to when some of these events transpired and what happened. So continuing on with Tablet 11, from the translation of George Smith in 1875, it states, their father Anu swore an oath, and their counselor, the hero Enlil. The great gods decided to send down the deluge. Their chamberlain, the god Ninurta, who, by the way, was the one who influenced the Byzantine eagle of the Roman Empire. And it specifically mentions the Ninurta, just like all these other tablets do too. All these characters are mentioned over and over again by tablets that sometimes span thousands of years of time periods. So it says, Princely Ea swore with them also, who is also known as Enki, repeating their words to a fence made of reed. O man of Shuruppak, son of Ubaratutu, demolish the house and build a boat, abandon wealth and seek survival. Spawn property, save life. Take on board the boat of all living things, seed. The boat you will build, her dimensions shall be equal. Cover her with a roof like the ocean below. So ocean below, just like this reference we had before of oceans, I think it represents the underworld being how it's under our earth and how it's a sealed place where, you know, the levels getting between them is a very difficult thing to achieve. So therefore it'd be like a barrier. So I think that's why it references as having some kind of a roof that can sustain, you know, a great deluge, cataclysmic events that were occurring at the time. Now, really quickly, I want to mention this information right here is almost identical to what's in the Atrahasis when he talks about the flood. And that it should be, because Atrahasis is the one telling the story. But that only reaffirms this information because it connects to all these other different pieces, okay? And it's basically talking about these disastrous events that occurred at the Younger Dryas, this period of about 12,000 years ago, when all of these incredible things happened where the ice caps all rapidly melted and there's possibly coronal mass ejections and potentially pole shifts, and all these horrible disasters occurred on the earth, which basically wiped out mankind. And it tells you, as I'm about to get into, the specifics of what happened with that. Continuing on, it says, I understand and spoke to Ea, my master. So it automatically, you can tell that he is, by the way, he's considered a son, a direct link to Ea, Enki, one of the great gods. So Enki, as we know in the Atrahasis, he goes against what he's supposed to, and he tells Atrahasis Untapishti about this cataclysm coming, but he forces him not to tell anyone else. That's and besides his family and those he's taking with him. But it says, I understand, I shall do it. But how do I answer my city, the crowd, the elders? What is his city? Shuruppak, because he's the last king of Shuruppak before the deluge. So he's not allowed to tell them. He says, what do I tell the people? I'm their king. What do I tell them about my departure? And Ea says to him, Ea opened his mouth to speak, saying to me, his servant, also you will say this to them, or you will say this to them. For sure, the god Enlil feels for me hatred. In your city, I can live no longer. I can tread no more on Enlil's ground. I must go to the ocean below to live with Ea, my master. The ocean below. We know that Ea, Enki, was assigned to rule in the underworld, to maintain balance there. That's the proof about what the term ocean means. It means that he had to tell his people who know all about these sky gods, right? They're fearful of them. He says, I have to leave to go and join the sky gods in the underworld, okay? Then it states, as we go on into tablet 11, the sky turned into darkness. Then came the deluge. Like a battle, the cataclysm passed over the people. One man could not discern another, nor could people be recognized amid the destruction. Even the gods took fright at the deluge. They left and went up to heaven with Anu. Right there, they left. They left our reality because of how devastating these events were. The goddess cried out like a woman in childbirth. Belet Ilia wailed, whose voice is so sweet. That is, by the way, that name is another name given for Ninma or Ninharsag, which is considered the mother of mankind. And she states, how could I speak evil in the gods' assembly and declare a war to destroy my people? Is it I who give birth? It is I who give birth. These people are mine. And now, like fish, they fill the ocean. Think about that for a minute. The people are all floating out in the ocean, dead everywhere, because they were killed in this deluge and almost no one survived. And these gods, some of them are weeping over their creation and how they allowed it to be destroyed, nearly destroyed, I should say. Then it states, the Anunnaki gods were weeping with her. For 6 days and 7 nights, the gale, the deluge, it flattened the land. All the gods shall come to the the incense, but the incense let Enlil not come. So they're afraid of Enlil, okay? Because Enlil lacked counsel and brought on the deluge. Boom, right there. Tells you that Enlil was actually responsible. He was known as the Lord of the Sky or Lord of the Air. He was responsible for the destruction of mankind, not Ea. Okay? It says, and delivered my people into destruction. Then at once Enlil arrived. He saw the boat. He was seized with anger, filled with rage at the divine Ajiji. From where escaped this living being? No man was meant to survive the destruction. Ea opened his mouth to speak, saying to the hero Enlil, you, the sage of the gods, the hero, how could you lack counsel and bring on the deluge? In the past, Untapishti was a mortal man, but now he and his wife shall become like us gods. Untapishti shall dwell far away where the rivers flow forth. That's a key phrase to make, like out of the ground, like springs, under the ground. Then it says like eternal springs. And then it ends by stating essentially that Untapishti tells him that there's nothing he can do to seek immortality. He tries and he fails, and he realizes that he tells him that essentially, if you want to be a physical being here, you will have a mortal life. All things die that are in a physical form. And so Gilgamesh is really disappointed and sad, and he travels back to Uruk, and he ends the tablet by giving these specific details about the city, which is so interesting because, yet again, I got to remind everyone that modern academics consider this all just a myth and fake. And yet, listen to what he says about the city. He says, O Shanabi, which is one of his servants, climb Uruk's wall back and forth, survey its foundations, examine the brickwork. Were its bricks not fired in an oven? Did the 7 sages, the Anuna, not lay its foundations? A square mile is a city. A square mile date grove. A square mile it is. A square mile of a clay pit. Half a square mile the temple to Ishtar. There you go. 3 square miles and a half is Uruk's expanse. Okay, so we get all this information in there that links all kinds of other cuneiform tablets, specific time periods, cities, all these things they tried to achieve. It tells us what happened to the Anunnaki. It tells us where they used to be, the last city that they were ever in, how they had such a strong influence on mankind from long ago, and that they almost disappeared from our reality in physical form, and we were made to fend on our own, and how these different time periods are separated by great disasters that led to human civilization having to rise up again and having to go seek out these great cuneiform stories that were almost lost, and after they found them, almost lost again. And here we are in 2019, and we're able to still be able to read these events that occurred 8 to 12 to 20 to maybe more 1,000 years ago, when basically our entire reality was different than it is now. Everything was different. These great gods were here walking among us. Kings ruled over people, but not like kings today. Kings who somehow had these great lifespans and were directly connected to wisdom that we have lost over time. And so I just find it completely fascinating that we have these nuggets that exist in these tablets that tell us this entire timeline and this incredible epic of human history. And it's almost completely unknown. You walk up to someone, you're like, hey, have you ever read the Epic of Gilgamesh or the instructions of Sharupak? They're going to look at you like you have 3 eyes. To me, that's a really sad thing that direction that we've ended up in our reality, where modern academics are so worried about their reputation and about this control of the narrative that's been held on here for so long, that they're willing to go along with this false perception and make everybody believe that none of this is real, that none of these incredible events occurred, and that all of it was just made up. And so that's why I feel like, Rex, that I fight so hard for this information to be known, because it's so incredible if you just sit down with this information, Try to close your eyes and imagine how all these things happen. You know, great civilizations rising up and being destroyed in great disasters, and having only a small percentage of humans even survive, because the very gods that created them some of them wanted to wipe them out so that they could start over and never have that creation ever exist here. But what happened? We barely survived because of Ea, because of Enki. And so it's a little it's a little troubling to me that so many people just see him as being a deceiver here, because even though he plays a role that's complicated in the underworld, in many ways, he's the only reason we're still here. He's the only reason why we survived this. I think we need to give him a lot more credit for that. But that's to me what is so incredible about these tablets and about the entire length of human history, Rex.
Well, it's fascinating, and I want to say something for a minute, because there's somebody in the chat that said their son's in college and they just read the Epic of Gilgamesh. I think that's a neat synchronicity. I would like to also say that I find it fascinating how much influence the Bible has on the world. And when you look at the foundations of the Bible, much of the stories come from these older Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets. And, you know, sometimes they'll have different names, but the stories are the same. And I feel that much of it is referring to astrotheological events, you know, these planetary bodies that were moving.
Like the bull in heaven he fights.
Just, yeah, I mean, the gods were literally battling in the heavens, right? And it seems to me like through the years, the leaders of certain dynasties would say, "I am the god, you put my name in history." And they would like add their name as a title of a god. So people would revere them and look at them as the ones that actually caused the earth to shake, caused the sun to belch out a 500,000 times the size of the earth burp of plasma that wiped out much of the solar system. So, and I got to say to the gentleman that kept saying, "Oh, you're promoting such and blah, 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 blah." Dude, we weren't, and I think you get that now. And, you know, I appreciate that person too. I do. I appreciate everybody in the chat. I appreciate all of you. However, I just needed to set the record straight that we're not promoting Sitchin. And I also wanted to say that I think that there's a lot of stuff that Sitchin has done that is very remarkable. So it bothers me when I see people going after other scholars or because they didn't get it all right. I'm thinking to myself, do you get everything right all the time? I mean, you try and translate 5,000-year-old tablets that have been broken into thousands of little pieces and go into that culture. Good luck. Do you think that you can translate it?
With a dead language that is no longer spoken anymore.
Yeah. I mean, give the people some credit, man. I don't think they're just disinformation. People are like, "Oh, well, that person was a Freemason." Well, so what? There's a lot of good Freemasons out there. It doesn't matter if they're a Freemason or not. I'm not a Freemason.
And it doesn't even matter anyway, because there's been all these other Assyriologist experts that translated to come with the same translated conclusions. So the whole argument is silly, because we have all these other creditable Assyriologist experts that have translated this and come up with the same references to the Anunnaki and about these names and cities. None of it's made up. It's just that we've been made to believe that it's a myth, because of this tightly controlled narrative of history, and how it's if we were to know the truth, it would completely blow it right out of the water.
Well, and let's talk about that for a minute, because history, like I'm going back to the Bible here, right? People will live and die based upon what they believe in. And if you believe in certain gods, you might be willing to go to war for those gods. If you believe in a monotheistic God that put together a book called the Holy Bible, and you follow that, and you believe your priest or your pastor or your bishop or your spiritual leader that says, "Well, you know what, there's a war coming and it's a spiritual battle." So you got to be real careful what you believe in. You've got to be real careful, because it can oftentimes be used for sinister purposes. But what Matt is saying is so powerful to think about, because so much has been linked to this. Yeah. But then when you talk about it, unless you're a part of the club, they're going to say, "Oh, it's just a story. It's just myth." Yet the whole world seems to be revolving around this myth in some way, shape, or form. It's so bizarre,
Isn't that amazing? Oh, we don't believe any of this stuff, and yet you go believe biblical stories that are mostly based on these to start with. That's the silly thing behind it. And I think the problem was also, Rex, is that a lot of the biblical stories were these rewritten versions that embellished things in ways where it made it seem impossible. Like, for instance, Atrahasis was the name Untapishti Atrahasis was the name that was given for Noah. And in that biblical version, he takes 2 of every animal and all this silly stuff when that's impossible. Of course it's impossible. It doesn't say that at all in this. It says that he took his farm animals, like the animals that he had on his land and his family. That's it. And seeds. That's what that says he brought with him. Not every animal all over the earth. That's so silly. But what they do, they turn that around into this fable so that people will automatically reject it as being just a symbolic story. It has no reference in history.
The Stage of Time, incredible read. And then plus all the documentation you have in the back with the tablets and the references is incredible. Matt, let's do this again in a month or two. What do you say, bro?
I love it. Awesome. Always up for another good discussion with you, Rex.
Anything you want to share before we close out?
I just want to say I appreciate everyone that supports me. Please go to thestageoftime.com if you want to read some of these ancient translations I've included. I'm still actively working on finishing the full purchasable audio for the Stage of Time. It's taking time because I'm trying to make it of a high quality, and as well as trying to put a lot of shows out. I have quite a few coming up in the future, but check out my YouTube channel at Matthew LaCroix, and check out my website at thestageoftime.com. And I just really appreciate so many of the incredibly supportive and open-minded people that follow my work and give me a thanks that I helped them and led them to do something different. It really is humbling and inspirational, and I really appreciate everyone that supports me.
Yeah, right on. Well, you are a fan favorite, and including myself, I think you're a legend, brother. So
thank you, Rex. I appreciate it.